Welcome to the Consumer Finance Podcast. I'm Chris Willis, the co-leader of Troutman Pepper's Consumer Financial Services regulatory practice. And today we're going to be talking about the CFPB's proposal to engage in regular data collection for the auto finance industry. But before we jump into that topic, let me remind you to visit and subscribe to our blogs, TroutmanPepperFinancialServices.com and ConsumerFinancialServicesLawMonitor.com. And don't forget about our other podcasts. We have lots of great ones. We have the FCRA Focus, all about credit reporting, the Crypto Exchange, about everything crypto. We have Unauthorized Access, which is our privacy and data security podcast. And finally, Payments Pros, which is all about the payments industry. All of those are available on all popular podcast platforms. And speaking of those platforms, if you like this podcast, let us know. Leave us a review on your podcast platform of choice and let us know how we're doing. And if you like reading and listening to our thought leadership content, don't forget to check out our handy mobile app. It's available for both iOS and Android. Just look for Troutman Pepper in your app store. When you download it, you'll find that it gives you easy access to all of our blogs, all of our thought leadership articles and releases, as well as listening access to all of our podcasts. It even has a great directory of all of our financial services industry lawyers and a handy calendar to tell you what conferences we'll be attending and speaking at. As I said, it's available for both iOS and Android. Just look for Troutman Pepper in your app store. Now, as I said, today we're going to be talking about the CFPB's proposal to engage in regular and, shall I say, very extensive data collection for the auto finance industry, using its authority for market monitoring under Section 1022 of Dodd-Frank. Joining me to talk about that are my colleagues, Brooke, Conkle and Chris Capurso. Brooke, Chris, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Chris. Great to be here.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having us.
I'm really glad the two of you are on. And of course, Brooke and Chris do work for auto finance companies all the time and have been doing it for a great deal of time. And this is a potentially very significant development by the CFPB because it really bespeaks a degree of monitoring of the market that is extremely extensive and goes well beyond anything we've seen under Section 1022 before. But I guess to level set us, Chris, let me go to you first. The CFPB is proposing to do this data collection under Section 1022 of Dodd-Frank. Tell the audience about what Section 1022 says and what it allows the Bureau to do.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and I guess the story goes back to November of 2022 when the Bureau first proposed developing this new data set idea under its authority to monitor consumer financial services markets. And the reasoning they gave was auto is an enormous part of the consumer financial services market, and it's growing because prices are up, rates are up, and that was all a baseline that they wanted to collect more info on how the market is operating. So they proposed or announced that they were seeking public comment on this proposal. And then just 3 short months later, 9 of the biggest auto finance companies received essentially data requests from the CFPB implementing this notion. And Chris, I wanted to ask you, this data request is pretty long. It's several pages and an outrageous amount of info. I'm curious, you represent these clients. What was their first reaction to getting this enormous list of data subjects?
Well, I think their initial reaction was similar to yours, that this is an incredibly large and burdensome request that requires an immense amount of detail over a very long period of time, much longer than your typical supervisory exam. And it was enough to get them questioning, what is the Bureau's authority under Section 1022 really all about? It's supposed to be market monitoring, but it seemed, because of the breadth and length of time of the request, that the Bureau may have been exceeding that authority. But the problem, of course, is that Section 1022 isn't very specific in terms of the limits on the Bureau's authority to collect this information. But Chris, let me come back to you. Tell the audience a little bit about what you saw as the focus areas for the CFPB and the pilot that was directed to the 9 larger auto finance entities.
Sure. And I have this list in front of me because anybody who's memorized this, 1, spent a lot of time, and 2, doesn't have a lot of time for anything else because it's enormous. I have the list in front of me, this immense amount of data subjects, and they're split into origination and servicing. The biggest area, from what I gather from it, is repossession. There's really an eye on repossession, and this makes sense because this is something that the Bureau has keyed in on. It's something that shows up in supervisory highlights, something that they're really focused on. And pretty much anything that you could imagine about repossessions is requested in this. The types of situations that led to them, what resulted from the disposal of the collateral, if that's what happened, what kind of refunding happened, whether GPS and starter interrupt were used. As Chris said, this is a request that goes pretty far back. This goes back to January 1st, 2018. I mean, that's now not only several years ago, but with a pandemic in between, it feels like an eon ago. So these auto finance companies are having to dig back into their annals to try to figure out basically every data point that could be associated with basically any account they've serviced. And as Chris said, it doesn't surprise me that the reaction was, my gosh, this is a lot. And again, this was targeted at 9 of the largest auto finance companies, and this was last year. And the more recent CFPB action was broader, maybe less specific, but it was, a request for comment. And we're going to hear a little bit about that.
That's right. And we're going to go into that in just a second. But one other focus area that I perceived from the pilot data collection process was not just repossessions, which was definitely very much in evidence, but also ancillary products and ancillary product refund issues, which is another area of perennial CFPB interest, both publicly expressed and as a matter of high emphasis in the supervisory exams that we assist clients with. So, Brooke, Chris alluded to the proposal that's now sort of out by the CFPB. Do you mind telling the audience what it is the CFPB has proposed to do on an ongoing basis in the future with respect to auto finance market monitoring?
Absolutely, Chris. What's interesting is that the CFPB is proposing to take sort of this massive data collection that it imposed upon the 9 biggest auto finance companies and taking that and putting it down to a smaller scale. So for those companies that originate between 500 and 20,000 loans in a calendar year would now be subject to many of the same kind of data requests that the CFPB imposed on the 9 biggest companies. So you see the Bureau really taking its document requests and foisting them upon lenders who aren't as big as the big guys are. So you have companies that are originating a much narrower sort of band of auto finance loans between 500 and 20,000, and they're going to also be providing this data to the CFPB on how their loans are originated and also how loans are repossessed, how vehicles are repossessed, not only repossessions, but also voluntary surrenders. So we have kind of end of account life issues that the Bureau is really focusing on here in this. I should reiterate, it is a proposal. It is not set in stone yet, but the Bureau is seeking authority to go ahead and target these companies that are originating a substantially fewer number of loans than sort of the big 9.
Well, that raises an interesting question, Brooke. So when the Bureau sent the 1022 orders to the 9 large market participants, it didn't have to get any approval from anybody and just went ahead and did it. What is the approval that they need to do this on the broader basis that you just described?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the Bureau published in the Federal Register, it's January 23rd of this year, they published the request for notice and comment. And specifically, the Bureau is requesting approval for the Office of Management and Budget for this new auto finance data project. So the Bureau needs the OMB's approval to be able to implement this project.
Got it. It'll be interesting to see what interaction may occur between the CFPB and the Office of Management and Budget with regard to that. But we're sort of waiting to hear in terms of that now. But I think now what I'd really like to do is get the two of you to discuss what would be the practical impacts for the auto finance industry if the Bureau is permitted to go forward as it has proposed, that is doing these extensive annual data requests to a very large segment of the auto finance market. Brooke, let me direct it to you first. What do you think some of the practical impacts may be?
Absolutely, Chris. Really, this is a significant swath of data. This is information that goes back over years. And so suddenly you have the CFPB really able to kind of not just track market variance or market variables, but also use that information for enforcement actions. And as the Bureau has stated, they're going to use the information for all legally permissible activities, and that includes enforcement. On the one hand, you have all of this data. On the other hand, you have the Bureau seeking this information from companies that aren't necessarily sort of designed to collect and provide this volume of information to the Bureau. So with the efforts now to seek this information from auto finance companies that are originating considerably fewer loans a year, even just 500, suddenly they're having to provide all of this data to the CFPB as well. And that can be a manpower problem where you have to devote significant resources to just being able to respond to these requests for data.
Chris, what's your take on the potential practical impacts on the industry from this if it goes forward?
Sure. And I was withholding that. I don't know if anybody here plays the game where you have to, it's like a sports game where there are grids and you have to pick people who correspond with like the teams on each side of the grid. All I could think was Mick Mulvaney hits the square for the CFPB and OMB, and that's where my brain's been. But in reality, I think this order, there is so much data that they are requesting from at least the 9, that if that carries over practically to the rest of the industry, first off, they're going to have to think about data collection at every single point of their process, because there are data points related to origination, even though, the CFPB doesn't have oversight over the auto dealers themselves who may be originating RICs if they don't, or if they assign them. But there are still questions for the servicers of those retail installment contracts about what the total amount was, what the fees were, things like that. So you got to think of it at the front end. And then you have to think on the back end, the type of data that goes into a repossession that they may have to get from vendors who are undertaking that. And it's just, they've got to be very careful to actually document all that stuff if this is going to be the way that the CFPB is going as far as data collection. And also, it's an interesting question the Bureau brings up in this most recent request for comment of ways to make it easier. Would it be easier if there was an automated system as opposed to having to do it themselves? And I'm sure people in the auto industry would just love an automated system created by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that they can implement into their own system. I'm sure that's just a winner in the industry, but just trying to figure out ways to make this easier. It seems like the CFPB even recognizes, I'm sure they don't care, but I'm sure they recognize that this is a big undertaking and it's just the scope. And the earlier order was to the 9 biggest ones. What about the 9 smallest ones who are going to still be subject to this, because this order would cover 500 originations or more, and that's pretty small. So what are those smaller entities going to do now that they may have to devote costs to data collection?
Well, I think you're both very right in terms of the potential burden on the industry, especially the smaller players. The other thing that I would point out with respect to this issue is something that Brooke alluded to. The Bureau said in the 1022 orders it issued to the 9 large market participants, we can use this information for any purpose, including enforcement. And it seems to me that this data collection exercise being directed to such a large portion of the industry is a way for the Bureau to sidestep the limits on its supervisory authority to larger participants, because it's not obviously limited to larger participants. And for larger participants, it might use the data to direct supervisory exams to inquire further into whatever it saw in the data. But for larger ones, it doesn't have supervisory jurisdiction. So enforcement is the only way that it can follow up with those companies. And it would seem likely to me that if you present yourself as an outlier in your data about repossessions or ancillary product refunds or anything else, then you might get a civil investigative demand asking for more information. And so I view it as a form of shadow supervision by the Bureau over a very large swath of the industry, the purpose of which is to, for the majority of the industry probably, serve as the basis for enforcement proceedings.
Chris, I agree completely. And I think one of the things that is most kind of curious about the data collection is that historically, we have advised auto finance companies to let consumer complaints be sort of the driver of your sort of remediation efforts. What are you seeing complaints about? Address those areas. And here, the CFPB is kind of flipping that idea on its head, where it is potentially going to be using enforcement actions that are driven not by consumer complaints, but by this collection of data and the Bureau's own initiatives. So we can look at kind of consumer complaints and use that as a general model for where we think the Bureau might be interested. But with all of this data in hand, the Bureau is not going to necessarily be driven by consumer complaints when it comes to enforcement actions.
Thanks a lot, Brooke. And I think this has been a really interesting discussion. And I think the audience will definitely come away from this understanding how serious the Bureau's data collection proposal really is, both in terms of the logistical issue of trying to collect and provide the data, but also from what may follow from an analysis of the data over at 1700 G Street. I'd like to thank both you and Chris for being on the podcast today, and also to make a special announcement. As I noted before, Brooke and Chris are very experienced in the area of auto finance, and I'm actually going to be turning over the reins of the Consumer Finance podcast for a special series that the two of them are going to record on lots of issues dealing with auto finance. So watch your podcast feed for some special editions of this podcast hosted by Brooke and Chris, where they're going to be talking about a variety of interesting, both regulatory and litigation issues affecting the auto finance industry. So Brooke and Chris, thanks a lot for today's episode and for the ones that you're going to be releasing. And thanks to our audience for listening today as well. Don't forget to visit and subscribe to our blogs, TroutmanPepperFinancialServices.com and ConsumerFinancialServicesLawMonitor.com. And while you're at it, why not visit us over at Troutman.com and add yourself to our Consumer Financial Services email list. That way we can send you copies of the alerts and advisories that we send out, as well as invitations to our industry-only webinars. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the show, check out our handy mobile app. Just look for Troutman Pepper in your app store on either iOS or Android. And of course, stay tuned for a great new episode of this podcast every Thursday afternoon. Thank you all for listening.
Copyright Troutman Pepper Hamilton Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.